Will, if, and how will the US dollar collapse? This hegemony is well known around the world. You know, it's the standard. The US dollar is traded internationally. Anytime countries want to buy commodities like oil, gasoline, natural gases, or anything really across the world, whether it's lumber or microchips, they have to convert their currency into US dollar in order to purchase. Now, will this hegemony, will this stronghold change in the near future? The whole world's talking about this right now. You can see it on all social medias. You can turn on your traditional news networks. You can see it from day-to-day people talking, you know, whether at the pub or at the coffee shop. People are thinking about this and how it will affect them. So in this video, I'm going to get into, will it collapse or will it change? Maybe it won't be the reserve currency. Maybe it'll just be a payment system. If this happens, how will this play out and how would this be executed? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to the Financial Almanac. I am Basil. Let's get right into this. So we've seen headlines with the BRICS nations, you know, getting together and, you know, doing changing among themselves. They have trade agreements. BRICS is basically, just as a short review for those that don't know, it stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South America. They also are accepting new members like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, the Middle East, people in Africa, people in South America, people in Asia, you know, and there's also people that are applying that are actually in Europe, but you know, nobody's talking about that. Germany is considering this, Italy is considering this, but that's besides the point. This is a new table being formed. They're not asking to join the table that the US and the Western allies have made. They are creating their own table, which has their own seats, and they're doing business with one another, bypassing the US dollar, right? If they start trading amongst one another in their own foreign currencies, and they start to lower their, you know, available US dollar transactions, how does this affect us today? In order to study how the US dollar hegemony, global currency standard, may unfold in the future, we have to look to the past and see how other major world currencies, how they performed in history as well. Now, the West recognizes really 6 currencies that were considered global standards for international trade. If we were to start off since the time of the Moorish Empire when that fell, it took place in 1492, but we will start off in 1450 with Portugal, up to 1530, where its global hegemony in terms of currency power was ruled around the world. It was the standard. From there, from 1530, it passed on to its neighbors, Spain. Back then it was called Andalusia. It became Spain, you know, under Ferdinand and Isabella, and that reign took place up to 1640. From 1640, the East Indian Trade Company, known as Netherlands and Dutch, came about, and they started calling Moors Indians around the world, and that's when they became the global power because of their, you know, operations, the East Indian companies. And so that global power basically took place from 1640 all the way to, I want to say, 1720, right? And so from 1720, they were the global hegemony. They passed that baton on to France. Now, France has its own history regarding the foundation of the United States and Benjamin Franklin, but I don't want to get into that today because they were the power from basically 1720 in terms of global currency standard all the way to 1815, roughly speaking. And then from there, the world reorganized with other global meetings, and then France passed that baton to England. And they became the center of power from 1850 to 1920 in terms of global currency hegemony. And from 1920 to today, we have the US dollar. If you want to learn more about that transition of power, you can always check out Ray Dalio's video, Changing World Order, to learn how as one country comes into power, the other one follows through, and there's basically a sine wave overlap over all of that history. So today we know that the US dollar is the standard hegemony for world currency. Now, what is a reserve currency? The overlapping reserve currency status that these countries had reigned in had basically had many things in common that included countries, you know, large countries, small countries, large multinational organizations and large entities. Basically, a whole of this currency, whether it's for payment systems, international investments, you know, foreign exchange reserves, they would hold them in their treasuries or in their savings, essentially, as a global reserve currency to do business with the rest of the world. So we see the US dollar has those features. Now, during the past, when we see these 6 global currencies and their reigns as they transition from one another, society, the day-to-day person, how would they preserve their value during times of fluctuations? We can see that today we might be going through that future. So one thing I want to share with you is we have to look at alternative investment options, things that perhaps are more specific to itself, that are, for example, non-fungible, rather than something that's very fungible like currencies. And so one thing that's also very non-fungible and is an alternative that we see through time and time in history is art. Art is very piece unique or artist unique, and it's very rare. According, you can find rare pieces, and that helped preserve a lot of value and wealth during the turmoil times that we've seen in the past during a global currency exchange. If we were to look at how art performed just last year in 2022, we can see that global auction houses, have reached above $20 billion just in trading hands in terms of art pieces. So there is this consensus, and we do see a pattern that this is a great place to preserve wealth. If you go to your financial institution and say you have a private wealth manager because your assets of investable funds are over $1 million or 100,000, whatever your range is, you're going to definitely be pitched art as an alternative investment asset to preserve your wealth. And if you're not pitched that, you might want to reconsider some staff that you have access to. So now let's explore how we may see patterns in the global reserve currencies of the past and how we may expect our hegemony to basically perform in the future. We can start off at 1450 with Portugal. Now Portugal, after the Moorish Empire fell, they basically took reign as the global currency for 80 years, and they expanded in exploration. They had to find what was basically not shown to them, right? And so that took place for a while. They were cut off by some smaller subsidiary of the Moorish Empire known as the Ottoman Empire to go into the West, right? And so they were basically focused, and they had to innovate. They were forced to innovate during these times. Portugal inherited quite a bit of technology, including navigation, from their predecessors. So they took that navigation in the sea, and they went to explore more of Asia, more of Africa, even what they would call the New World, right? Here in Americas, North, South, and Central. And because of their newfound navigational prowess, they created military outposts as far out as China and Japan, Malaysia, India, even in Africa. And as the Portuguese extended to those regions, that created some vulnerabilities that other countries have saw, and they said, you know what, let's attack them and basically take what they have inherited from the Moorish Empire, and these countries believe that they can do a better job, such as the Dutch and the French and the English, right? So they're like, hey, it's not personal, it's just business. And so we see in history what happened after Portugal is actually they joined Spain. Now, Spain took place from 1530 to 1640 as the hegemony for 110 years, which is quite a large amount of time, and they formed what we call today the Iberian Union. Now, they had the first global reserve currency in silver dollars that basically spanned the world from Asia to Africa to the Americas. So most of the silver coins that the Spanish used around the world was actually found in South America, right? One of the secret remnants of the Moorish Empire. And so they took that silver and they allowed that recognition to spread around the world. And that was the standard, and that abundance became the global standard currency. And they did very well for quite a bit of time there until there was a lot more revolutions and civil wars and regular wars until about the mid-1600s. And so with the Iberian Union basically collapsing, Netherlands came and filled that power gap with the East Indian Trading Company, which is the first multinational traded corporation that happened around the globe. So the Netherlands basically had the East Indian Company, which was trying to protect its trade in the Indian Ocean and other parts of the world as well, alongside trying to preserve and keep their independence from Spain. So the Dutch did very well in terms of preserving their strength from the Iberian Union, from Spain and Portugal, by providing a lot of trade to the rest of Europe during this time. So France and England saw how well they were doing in their trade, and they started creating their own trade lines from the Dutch, and that's what caused them to head butts later on down the road. And because the French and the English did such a good job at saturating the trade market, that basically created a weakness for the Dutch, and they started to slowly lose their effectiveness in the trade. That caused a lot of war, and they eventually lost their global currency status. And because of their successes in the trade wars, France became the next in line to be the global reserve currency since around 1720 to 1815, for those 95 years after the Dutch had fell. And France is under guidance now under King Louis XIV, and he basically had built up so much debt, because of his lavish parties, but also because of wars. There was a lot of debt in France during that time. Because there was such a massive debt during that time, they had to basically impose heavy taxes. And the public didn't like that, right? It's similar to what we have in the States. And so what would happen is in 1789, there was a French Revolutionary War that caused a lot of chaos, a lot of turmoil for the people, and this outrage basically took place. So after this economic turmoil that's happening, that caused the Revolutionary War, about 10 years later, a decade later, we have Napoleon entering the scene. And so here's this guy, Napoleon, right, with his Napoleon complex. As we know, he basically had a whole bunch of wars that basically accumulated into 1815, and that caused overextension of the military. That allowed a new force to come in and sweep up France. And so enter stage left, Great Britain. Great Britain comes into the scene after the Napoleonic Wars. It takes an overextended, French army down, and here we are from 1815 to about 1920, the Great Britain era begins. So the English dominated, after the Napoleonic Wars came the Battle of Waterloo of 1815, and after Napoleon's forces were crushed, for about 105 years after that time, British did very well. They successfully had their currency as the standard global currency around the world. And during this time was the, petroleum, fossil fuel age, industrial revolution took place, capabilities for shipments has, exponentially grown in naval capabilities, and things were looking very good for Britain. And because this small island basically had their tentacles because of their military prowess in the naval army, they were basically able to take over the world, because if you control the high waters, you control global trade. And so the British Empire did very well for a very long time until the World War I took place from 1914 to 1918. The British Empire accumulated massive amounts of debt. Their economic strength has waned quite a bit, and basically the US came in place and benefited from this weakness that the British Empire had. And today with 2020 vision, World War I, we can see the US benefited quite substantially because they were funding both sides of the war. Anytime people needed produce or manufacturing from either side of the World War I, they came to the US, and the US said, hey, no problem, we're out of this, but here's your supplies. So they benefited quite a bit. It took the United States of America from the state of basically being an unindustrialized, agricultural-based economy to a very industrialized manufacturing economy. And because of this role the United States has provided, it actually created the United States to have the healthiest economy. Even though it wasn't considered the world dominant currency, it was considered the healthiest. So some estimates say that 1920 was when it became the global currency, but technically that took place not a lot later, only in 1944 after the Bretton Woods Agreement, where the whole world got together, essentially most of the world got together and decided that the US dollar will be used as international global currency as long as they're backed by gold. And so after the world agreed that they will be backed by gold, they will be trading the US dollar instead of gold because it's a lot lighter on, to ship and trade with. The infrastructure was built around the world. Today we call it the SWIFT system, to help countries basically trade in US dollar because there was a trust that the US dollar was backed by gold. And so a lot of countries sent their gold to the United States. That way they can say, hey, you have my gold, give us this many dollars, because it was pegged, assuming the US Treasury would keep their promise and peg to $35 per 1 ounce of gold. So later in time, as we know today, our dollar isn't backed by gold anymore because of events that took place in 1971. So in 1971, Richard Nixon did close the convertibility window from US dollars into gold, and that upset the world. So today we know that it's not backed by gold or any other precious metal or commodity for that reason. And not only that, what is it backed by? Today they'll say trust in God, might be the Governance Ordinance Division in the church, or it might be the US military basically defending the status that it has by force. So we see that military, defenses does not always keep up the currency, as we've seen that with the Iberian Union, as we've seen that with the Dutch Empire, as we've seen that with the French Empire. Sometimes military occupation and overextension might be the weakness actually to create oppositional powers to come in and find those reflexes and that, stone defense of yours and just chip it away, and then boom, the crack happens and the floodgate opens. Even though today the US infrastructure has never been seen at this extent, it's been very strong and it's expanded around the world, and also the military has never been this strong at any time in history as well. So those are very strong arguments to defend the US hegemony. Not only that, most goods and services around the world are priced out by the US dollar, especially when it comes to big entities and big countries and big corporations. There's even countries out there that have pegged their national currency to the US dollar, and that takes a long time to depeg. But that's a problem also with innovation. Some things that are more traditional and something new, modern and innovative comes around, and it, gets rid of the old guard and introduces a new guard. And that's what we see with innovation, whether it's the Industrial Revolution or a formal global empire. So because of the lessons we learned from the past, we can say today that for any currency that wants to replace the US dollar hegemony, a few things have to take place. Whether it's a special drawing rights, the SDR, or whether it's the BRICS nation commodity-based currency, they have to be able to have certain fundamental things to basically succeed in that transition from the US hegemony to their new currency. They have to be able to handle trillions of dollars of trade today, per day. They also have to be able to do hundreds of thousands of transactions per second. And not only that, they have to have a global trust. They have to have the rule of law on their side. So let me ask you this. When it comes to China, do you trust them? Do you believe in their rule of law? Because they might have manufacturing and all this other jazz, but guess what? Do you trust them? Would you back your currency with the yuan and the renminbi? I don't. Would you? So for example, in the BRICS nation, people are talking of a lot of trade between the yuan and their currencies and whatnot. But here in the West, I don't know much about Chinese yuan. So how can I have rule of law when it's been very quiet? And we know the government over there likes to keep things private in the private sector, which is fine when it comes to their international global affairs, right? They exercise their private rights. Compared to us here, we like things to be more public, right? Which is our right, their right. I'm not condoning anything better than the other, but it is a rule of law that you need to have global trust in order to be a replaceable global currency. And I don't think China is there yet. So having said that, there's probably so many people here that had the same consensus that we don't really understand China. The rule of law there is a lot more murky. And because of this consensus, we cannot allow China to get the upper hand. But because of COVID, we saw a lot of weaknesses in our manufacturing, especially when it came to masks, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing. We had to import quite a bit from China. Not even China, sometimes it's even Taiwan, whether it's silicon chips. We have to develop manufacturing here. During that pandemic, the whole globe saw this ad that says, you guys are vulnerable to China. You import everything from China. Shipping containers are being backed up in China, from China, coming here on our shores. Like, what are we going to do? How are we going to allow this to happen? So we need to restructure our land and bring manufacturing back here to America. That way we strengthen our weaknesses while we still have the superpower capabilities and hegemonies that we infer onto the planet. So we need to bring back manufacturing here, back to the Americas, and not be so reliant on the Far East, or else that will give us our Achilles heel and history will right itself. And so as we can see also in history, when the Dutch trade was being flooded by the English and the French, that saturated the market, it weakened the Dutch's hegemony. We can also take away manufacturing from China if we were to bring manufacturing here, because in that effect, we would also be flooding and supplying our own market. Right? They want to be a consumer nation, but they're not. They're a manufacturing supplying nation. So let's take away a lot of their strength by bringing back manufacturing here. That's why our labor force does need to be supported a lot. And if this does continue, we can actually prevent quite a large transition of power. So if we don't transition into manufacturing, this is how things will play out. So if we were to consider some bad case scenarios where China does try to put pressure as a global hegemony and their yuan, how would that play out with other currencies around the planet? Well, the US today is by far the #1 used currency internationally speaking. And a distant second is the euro. After the euro is the Japanese yen. And then comes the yuan, right? So they're far from being even close to be the number one traded international currency. And as far as I know, there's no country out there that's pegging their currency to the yuan like they have today with the US dollar. So some of you may say, listen, man, some countries out there are no longer buying US treasuries. They're no longer holding US currencies. They're holding gold now in their treasuries rather than US dollars. And how will that play out? Well, guess what? In 1990, right? And 10 years before that, 1980, for those 10, for that decade, the US dollar treasury in those countries have actually dropped just under 50% of their reserves. Today, we have 60% of the countries around the world hold US dollars as a reserve. So we're doing a lot better, even though it might feel like the BRICS nations are doing this and that and the next thing, we're doing all right. And so with the BRICS nation being around the corner, what if their currency, how will it destabilize the US? Well, guess what? Last time a currency was introduced around the world, the euro dollar. The euro dollar today is still by far away from the first reserve currency. Yes, there's countries out there that hold quite a bit of euros in their reserves, but it's nowhere near the amount of the US dollar. So even with the European nations coming together and creating a US dollar, right? The countries we spoke about, Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, the British, those are all the powers that we talk about. If they all came together, and guess what? And Germany, on top of that, made the euro, right? And they're by far only just in second place and far away from the first. Why would you worry about the BRICS nation? Unless you hold gold and silver and you want to reap those benefits as a hedge against this transition, I don't blame you. I love gold. I love silver. I love commodities I can hold in my hand, right? Including private keys for my Bitcoin as a small hedge just in case, so I can have that transportability around the planet. So as it stands today, the big dog on the planet is still the US, right? And its military backing the US currency. Now, there's a guy named Henry Kissinger in history, right? I'm basically paraphrasing. He said, if you control the supply of food, you control the people. If you control the supply of energy, you control the continent. And if you control the supply of money, you control the globe, right? I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember it quite exactly. But essentially the idea is this. Right now, we're still controlling quite a bit. We have quite a bit of currencies pegged to the dollar. There's still international trades out there that are superseding all other currencies in terms of they have to back it by this in order to exchange for that. And so there's a lot of strength that we still have in today. But having said that, so when you have some power and it's been here for a while, you basically create some weaknesses in your system, right? You become complacent with basically how things are running. This creates softness. This creates arrogantness. This creates people to have this entitled mentality, and that allows people that don't have the same view as you see weaknesses that you don't see because you have a blind spot. They'll see weaknesses in you, and this creates a psychosis of looking on people on the outside as an enemy, right? And that's what we clearly see today, not only in our streets but also out there as well. In the US, we're spending money as if it actually meant something. The national debt is just increasing. We're just servicing the interest. We're not actually paying down the debt. We're just servicing the interest. And we're struggling with that at best because, we have the debt ceiling coming up in June 1st. And there's people saying we may have a technical default. We may not, historically speaking, it's just all this charading. But guess what? We're still servicing the debt. We haven't even paid down the debt, right? So we're spending currency rather than money because money is gold and silver. We're spending currency when we don't have anything for it, right? So this arrogantness, this fever, this pitch is around our country, and it's actually very contagious around the world, and the world's seeing this and they're doing something about it. And because of the chinks in the armor that we have today in our currency, we have foreign influencers and actors affecting not only our politicians like Justin Trudeau or Joe Biden, they're also buying up quite a bit of real estate and giving back our currency that is backed by nothing, and buying a lot of our land and influencing a lot of our multinational corporations as well, indirectly. And that's not even touching base on like some other foreign CBDCs and dividing our people into two different, state of minds, having basically a very virtual and almost, on the precipice of a civil war. Now, am I saying this is going to happen soon? Not even close. I hope not. But I'm not saying it's happening soon either way. What I'm saying is this: if we continue to be arrogant and cocky and, bold and laugh and be influenced by foreign actors, and our politicians are spineless and become, everything starts to deteriorate, then yeah, these guys are basically going to step up and take charge, because we've basically gained dementia, right? We've lost our sensibilities. If we keep using our currencies and keep printing money as if we have money forever, and hyperinflation comes about, way before hyperinflation comes, there's going to be a new superpower in town, because they would have stabilized their currency and other countries would have joined in forces with them, and we would lose our dominance. But long before that happens, we have to put our minds together. We have to make sure we have sound economics and sound monetary values. As a day-to-day people, we need to make sure we have exposure to physical gold, physical silver, have your private keys for your Bitcoin, and make sure you have your papers ready, have more than one passport. That way you can travel to a lot more places around the world. And not only that, we have the precipice of technology being super changing everything today, right? And with the explosion of artificial intelligence, biomedical genomic technology, and other amazing manufacturings and robotics and other sectors of technology as well around the corner, we better get our act together, because if we don't, other people that are getting their act together will perform quite a bit better. And in order to maintain our integral family's protection and our love for the loved ones we have around us, we have to make sure we have sound money principles and be able to have liquidity to buy dips when it comes to the market. That will happen probably later on, but we want to make sure we have our gold, our precious metals on hand, and not in some ticker out there on the stock market. You want to make sure you have some exposure to Bitcoin in case you need to cross borders and your confiscation of wealth doesn't happen to you. So we have a little exposure in that as well. At the end of the day, you want to make sure you're financially savvy, financially literate, have exposure to many passports. That way you can travel and cross borders quite readily if things go south. But there are ways to prepare. Make sure you comment and let me know your thoughts down below. Like if you like, and make sure that you subscribe, because in the next few videos I'll be speaking about how countries out there are returning US treasuries back here, and we have to give them cash that we have to print. That increases our national debt. It also increases inflation, because we've increased the monetary supply of dollars, and how that will affect your bottom line, your investments, your assets, and also your liabilities. So make sure to subscribe. Thank you for watching the Financial Almanac. I'm Basil. Till next time. Bye-bye.